Okay, hello everyone.
Hi, Rabbi.
So today, the topic I want to speak about is something a little bit different than we usually do. But Rav Aryeh asked me to discuss some Jewish personalities in history, and I want to share with you a personality that I think most people don't know about. Most people don't know about him, and that's why I want to speak about him to revive his memory. She is Siftotav Dovavot Bakever. Part of what we do in Machon Magen Avot, which is a publishing house that I help and I try to print books from, is we try to find old manuscripts from Hachamim. So, for example, everyone's learning Masechet Yoma now, which is in the Daf Yomi. So there's a sefer that came out from Machon Magen Avot 2 years ago called the Shita Ktav Yad, Rabbi Avram ben Musa, who's based on the famous sefer Siach Yitzchak, who quotes him over 400 times. And Rav Avram ben Musa was published through Machon Magen Avot. It's on MoroccanHalacha.com, and it revived his memory. People didn't really know him so well, and that's one example of one of the Chachamim that you could learn more about reading in his introduction. There's also a famous, great story behind it that Rabbi Yoel Gold told over. Now, this Chacham that I want to speak about is called Rabbi Yaakov Benaim. Who is Rabbi Yaakov Benaim? Rabbi Yaakov Benaim was a Chacham that was born in the early 1700s in Morocco. He learned he was born and he learned in the city of Fez. He got married at around 15 years old. Because I have a friend in Israel that uncovered old ketubot, like the writing, like they kept a diary of ketubot, whatever ketubot they wrote for whoever, and they saw him named over there. He got married, was like 15 years old, and he wasn't particularly well known at that time, but slowly but surely he developed in one of such a prominent Talmid Chacham that the Chida speaks about him in glowing terms, and there are piskei halacha that we discuss nowadays that you'll see that come from him. And his sefer was not really well known because it was printed once. We're going to see in Livorno, that's in Leghorn in Italy, and it wasn't a very clear sefer, so it's being reprinted again. So, in reprinting Machon Magen Avot, so I discovered about his life, so I wanted to share with you. And that whole era, because people don't know it so well, it was called the Golden Era of Morocco. In the 1700s, there was a tremendous amount of Chachamim at that time. If one ever visits the cemetery of Fez, he'll see as he goes in, there's a big kever from Rav Yehuda ben Attar. Yehuda ben Attar was known in Arabic as El Kabir, the great rabbi. And it's written on the kever there of Rav Yehuda ben Attar that this holy man, whenever there would be a din Torah and people would disagree and they'd have to make an oath, a shvuah, they would go to his kever to make that shvuah, just to make sure that people would be scared and they wouldn't make a shvuah, an unnecessary shvuah. That was Rav Yehuda ben Attar. So he had a bet din together with somebody called Haya'avetz Asfaradi. There's a Ya'avetz known as Rav Yaakov. And this is Rav Yaakov ibn Sur, another Ya'avetz in Morocco that was also considered one of the great Dayanim. He's the one that was involved more with Rav Yaakov Benaim. Just to give you a perspective, this bet din had on it such great people that the Or HaChaim HaKadosh, before he left Morocco to print his books, he went there to get a haskama. And the story goes like this, that he told the Or HaChaim HaKadosh, asked them for haskama, and they weren't into titles in Morocco the way that they are nowadays, that every single person that comes off the street, they're going to give him massive titles, a Gaon, a Gadol, and this, sometimes people write something, and I tell them, this is a joke. Sometimes they say, oh, Rabbi, you're great, this, that, and that. I say, okay, between you and me, I know exactly who I am. Take away all those titles. From Shlomo Zalman, when they would write, once a letter came to his mailbox, and it said Rashka Bahag, Resh Kol Bnei Agula. He called the person up. He says, "How dare you? I'm embarrassed from the mailman. He sees such ridiculous titles. Don't ever write that to me again." But in Morocco, they were very careful about titles. So when Or HaChaim HaKadosh came for a haskama by the Bet Din HaGadol, they gave him Keharav. Chaim ben Attar is here, and he's a great Rav, and we give him a haskama. So he said, nobody's going to buy my book. Chav Heiresh Kehar It's not. Could you add in at least a mem? Kemo Hareinu Rav. Not the Orach Chaim HaKadosh cared about his kavod, but he wanted his books to sell. So the Bet Din said the following: we gave you Kehar Hashem, Keheresh. We gave you Kehar Hashem, and you want Kemohar Habetulot with the mem. You want like the amount that we give, a much greater amount. That was the way the story went. So either way, this was known as the great Gedolei Ador that there was in those times in Morocco, and that's where Rav Yaakov Benaim learned from. Now, at an early age already, it seems to be that he learned under a certain Rav called Rav Ephraim Monsonego, originally from the city of Tetuan. Then he went in 1757. He wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael. Now, in his Teshuvot, he talks about going to Eretz Yisrael in the Zera Yaakov itself. That's the Shilot Teshuvot that he wrote. He wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael, but a lot of Chachamim in those times, on their way of going to Eretz Yisrael, they got stuck in certain cities that they couldn't leave them because they saw there was no Torah. So the first city that he went to is, in Hebrew, it's called El Mascara. Mascara. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Somewhere in Algeria. And he calls it's a small city where there's a few Yirei Elokim Anshe Emet Oseh Tzedakah Bechol Et Am Nivcharim. They always do tzedakah. So he found a place that he could learn Torah. It wasn't so busy for him. They once had Rabbi Yaakov Kaminetsky, who was a rabbi later in Toronto and in New York, that what was his best years? He says, when I was a rabbi in a small village that nobody bothered me in Europe, that I was able to learn. That's where I grew the most. And that's the reality by a lot of rabbanim when they're hidden in a corner that nobody knows about them, and that's what happened with him. But eventually he had to move on, and in 1766 he continued on his journey. First he went to another city, the big city in Algeria called Argil. Algeria, the city of Algiers in Algeria. There was some of the greatest Chachamim we've ever had. The Rivash, the Tashbetz, his son the Rashbatz. After that, the Yachinu Boaz. These were all not the Yachinu Boaz of the Mishnayot. Another one that they were all from Algeria together with Rav Yehuda Ayash, which Rabbi Kiva Eger and the Chida quote extensively. These were the great Gedolim in the time of Algeria. That's where he found a place to study and learn. He came right after the Beit Yehuda Ayash. He quotes him many times. But to make a long story short, in 1782, he goes to Livorno. Now, he didn't decide to go to Eretz Yisrael, probably because the big printing presses were in Livorno. And this is a big difference between Chachamim that were able to get to Italy and not. For example, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, that's where he printed his books. And we know all the books today. Then he went to Eretz Yisrael, and he only stayed there for a year, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. The story is, he went to the Kotel. There was a lady in black that told him that he met her, and he goes back to his students. He say, "I know I'm going to die this year." He met the Klipa Lilit, and he's going to die this year. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh. That's why he died young, and he's buried in Har HaZeitim. So yeah, but he first went to print his books, and that's how we know so much about the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. There were so many Chachamim in Morocco that we didn't know about because they didn't get to Livorno. They weren't able to print their books. But Rav Yaakov Benaim did. So he actually printed his book called Zera Yaakov. He has a few more books. There's a Peirush that they recently, that you could look at Hebrew books called Chesed Ve'emet, that has his Chidushim on Brachot and Sukkah, that was from Rav Yitzchak Tzaba. But he himself wrote this Shilot Teshuvot Zera Yaakov, that the Chida quotes about him amazing things. Others quote amazing things. If you take a look in Hilchot Purim, there is a discussion, what is the amount of money you have to give for Matanot LeEvyonim? And the Shari Tshuva there quotes the Birkei Yosef, which is the Chida, who quotes the Zera Yaakov, who proves that the Shir is an amount of a Seuda. How much would it be a Seuda, which is Gimel Betzim or whatever? See, Rav Ovadia Yosef, he says it's the amount to buy a falafel. That is Matanot Avinim. I'm sure you heard that before. That comes from the Zera Yaakov. And the Shari Tshuva writes over there, I don't have the book, so I can't look up what his source is. That is the book, Zera Yaakov, and he's quoted in a few other very fundamental questions regarding what's the shear of a beitza and a kezait. He has one fundamental question that I'm working on right now while I'm learning some of the things of Choshen Mishpat from Magen Avot, and it's written there that he has questions. They had something called, in those days, called a shtar hatava. Nowadays we would call it a buyout clause. If I sell you a piece of land because I'm stuck, I need the money. The Torah doesn't want you to lose your money, your land just like that. There's a whole parashiot about Batei Iri Choma. So what people would do, the Gemara in Bava Metzia talks about this, what people would do is that they would sell the land, and the other person would say, okay, and I'll sell you back the land if you get the money in 30 days. I'll sell it back to you. But the problem is, if I sell, let's say I'm going to sell Aryeh land, and he's gonna say, I'll give it back to you. So what's happening so is it a loan that he's lending me money because he's eventually going to give it back to me? If it's a loan, he can't be eating from that field because that's ribit. So the Gemara says what has to happen is that I give you the land, and because of and it's a total transaction, but because of Aryeh's tremendous chesed, Hitiv chazdo, he does me a favor, and he writes, I will sell it back to you when you get the money back. That's not, and then he can eat from the fruits, because that's called ribit, because it's coming on his own will. In French, we call it sa volonté, his voluntary goodness. He's such a kind person, and he writes a shtar hatava. Shulchan Aruch brings this down in Choshen Mishpat Siman Reish Zayin Siv Zayin, as well in Yoreh Deah Siman Kufayin Bet. That's called the shtar hatava. There's all types of ramifications over here. Is it really called his field? For example, does he have the halacha of a bar metzora, that he's the guy right next to the other field, that he has the first dips to that field when they're going to sell it? Is it called that it's really his, that if chas v'sholom somebody would die, so the bechor would get pishnaim because it's called muchzak? All these type of questions come into play. Rav Yaakov Benaim has around 5 or 6 teshuvah just on Shtari Hatava. And all the Dayanim of Morocco quoted him, Vayomer Yitzchak, and they all discuss his teshuvot with great reverence. But this is an example of a chacham that he would have never been known if he wouldn't have traveled to Livorno. And there were so many of those that are lost. So it's actually an exciting project. I wanted to share with you about his life. I'll end off with a nice tidbit. I never know why these projects fall into my lap. Why specific projects fall into my life. It's just funny how. One time I was looking for a certain project and I couldn't find it, but somebody else found another of these writings. I found he was a cousin of my grandmother. Didn't know why. It was my first cousin, Rav Chaim David Serrero. Then Rav Avram ben Musa, that I mentioned to you, I'll tell the story quickly, is that my friend Nisim Wanunu wanted to sponsor the book, and in the meantime his son Lo Aleinu had an asthma attack, and he was brain dead, and Canada just put out a law that they're allowed to pull the plug, and the whole From community in Toronto went and lobbied. Remember that story? Yes. And they passed a bill that you're not allowed to pull out the plug. He lived longer, and he passed away the exact date of the yortzeit of Avram ben Musa, which we were sponsoring the sefer for him. We didn't even realize. Chaf Aleph Adar, which happens to be my birthday. That's the story Yoel Gold said over. It's an amazing story. And here I just found out of Yaakov Benaim. Somebody came to me with documentation that I have my great grandmother. Her name was Chana Budbul. Was a direct descendant of Rav Yaakov Benaim's sister. Crazy. I don't know how it happened. I didn't know this. So we always see siyata dishmaya and things going on, but there's so many great Hachamim that are just, their works are just sitting dormant and people don't know about them. And this is one of them that we got the opportunity to share about his Torah. His name is Rav Yaakov Benaim. Yezichro Baruch. Chazaku Baruch.